First, you don't know what love is.
I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
אהבת עולם את ישראל עמך.
Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Abim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together.
And now for something completely different.
Okay, somewhat, but the second half of the video does qualify. I don't usually in these videos go into the more Kabbalistic side of things, but if that interests you particularly, you might want to stay through to the end. In the meantime, here are a few words that might evoke a feeling or two. God and love. At least for the first of these two words, I realized the complexity of using this word in a new way when way back in the late Bronze Age, as a student rabbi in a congregation that shall not be named here, I was told, don't ever use the word God in a sermon. You will lose the entire congregation. You know, to a rabbi, or at that point, a future rabbi. Now, if you are approaching this from inside Judaism, your reaction to this will vary greatly depending on your various continua, from religious to secular, from diligent follower of the mitzvah to mitzvot don't really have a say in my life. For some Jews, the only problem with saying God would be wondering if the person saying the word has properly put a dash in the place of the O, or worrying about which name of God should be used for which occasion. If you are approaching this video from outside of Judaism, your level of confusion, annoyance, or shrug of shoulders will mostly come from the religious to secular continuum. If very religious, what the heck is wrong with them? If very secular, well, good on them. Too much God stuff out there anyway. Like most Jewish communities in Germany, this particularly community from which came such a strange rebuke had a majority FSU, or former Soviet Union Jewish population. The person who rebuked me, although not from the FSU, had grown up in a Warsaw Pact country and knew more of what he was talking about than I was able to understand or admit in that moment. I think what he was really trying to say was, the majority of people that attend services here, that unnamed place, grew up atheist as a matter of both state policy and practicality. Their Judaism, even if very strongly religious today, is nonetheless based on cultural heritage and a few bits of practice that could be passed on and not attract the state police. They have not had the cultural inundation of the word God, like you, meaning me at the time, that came from the United States. For them, regardless of your intention, the word God is a stumbling block that will prevent them from hearing what you have to say, no matter how good that may be. Fair enough. I probably would have reacted slightly better had it been explained to me something like this, but the explanation is one that I've developed now over the last 15 years of wrestling with that rebuke and trying to find a way to get past that wall when in a mostly FSU congregation. Oh yes, and if you are a non-Orthodox Jewish from an Anglo country, you probably have similar prejudices, merely for different reasons. In our current age, we hear God spoken and see this as the word uttered by the crazies who thump Bibles and vote for creation and education in public schools. If we attend shul regularly, we may be okay as we utter the names of God in prayer. But that's because we believe we know what we're saying, right? Plus, again, going into our collective mindset, we're not crazy, right? We're sane. But if we're thinking about it and getting honest, when in general society someone just says God in good old plain English, well, it can sound a little off, right? And believe it or not, love is just as problematic, although for slightly different reasons. Rock and pop lyrics make our confusion clear. That concert was from 2010. You think someone would have tried to tell him by now. Just kidding. Love that song. Love is quite a flexible word in English and can be expressed on the one side as a throwaway line as we bite into tasty sushi. Oh my goodness, I just love spicy tuna on a roll. Or as the central word of a statement of eternal devotion on the other side. I love you. One of these things is not like the other, or at least should not be, no matter how good that sushi is. Like genius, the word love is so overused that the sublime is easily smothered by the mundane. If we uttered that the melodies on our newest favorite pop album were genius, and then never thought of them again after a month at the same time everyone else forgot them, they most likely weren't genius. If we stopped thinking of someone and ghosted them 2 days after we professed our love for them, chances are the use of the word was cynical. manipulative or spoken with no more reverence than that reserved for sushi or the pop album. The combination of these two words and potentially unclear meanings comes to a head exponentially in one of the most oft-repeated verses in the Torah, also part of Parashat Vaetchanan, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the eternal, your God. There we have it. Love and God together. And it really is the simple stuff that gets us. There are phrases so commonly uttered that we simply do not ponder the depth, import, or obligation inherent in the words. You shall love the eternal, your God qualifies. Back to God for a second. If you are even a few videos into the site, you know that every other week I'm going to remind everyone that God is not the bearded dude on the ceiling. Jewish tradition has worked hard to move us out of using any human attributes for the eternal, and the obvious use of them in Torah falls into Dibra, Torah, Kalashon B'nai Adam. Torah speaks to us in everyday language. In this theology, God does not have a mouth, and so anything God says needs to be understood as the best we could do with everyday words to describe the indescribable. So if God's not something that we can visualize and comprehend visually, what is it that we're supposed to love? And then back to the word love. What is the action that the transitive verb to love is calling us to perform regarding this undescribable universal binding concept? All right, too much? Deep breath, and let's try this again. I know and can prove beyond sushi and pop music that we, all of us, do not understand love. The central verse in Torah that leads to the universal ethics in both Judaism and Christianity is from back in Parashat Kedushim, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In case we decide to narrowly define neighbor in an attempt to loophole ourselves out of how we treat others, we then get added a few verses later, and the stranger in your midst you shall love as yourself, or you were once strangers in Egypt, right? Compassion because we were once on the other side. Hillel later epitomized both of these verses into the practical rule, that which is reprehensible to you, do not do to another. Now, ignoring for a second the fact that essentially every religious and philosophical tradition, both East and West, has an analogous ethical center to their traditions, if only the two world religions that use the books of Moses as central texts actually followed this, those roughly 2.6 billion people, that is 2.6 billion Christians and 16 million Jews, would transform the world. But we don't. We simply either do not love our neighbors and the stranger as ourselves, or we misunderstand love, or both, or neither. We just don't know what to do, as we simply do not translate what we say is important into tangible action. Our issue, at least in the Western world, comes at us from Romanticism. Love, since this artistic, literary, and aesthetic shift in the 18th century moved love from the practical to the abstract ideal. Sure, we see shadings of this hundreds of years earlier. Shakespeare's sonnets are as good as any example. But love has become, at least outside of religion, that thing reserved for family and partnership. Look how quickly that narrow focus is going to stop us from following through with even contemplating what it means to love our neighbor, and how much more so the stranger. If figuring out how to love the stranger, which model do we use? The one for mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, or spouse? And if we look outside of that, are we stuck with comparing ourselves to Mother Teresa, which is way more complicated and problematic than most folks are willing to discuss? I submit that we read love your neighbor, love the stranger, and love God, nod importantly in agreement with the centrality of these verses, and then do nothing further, as there's no pathway from these words to a practical expression of these words. At best, we may utter the possibly far too often uttered, I'm a good person, as we secretly in our hearts hope we are, and fear we are not. This is where I get to utter the disclaimer that the asking of these questions does not lead to the conclusion that I've found a clear enough answer to follow these mitzvot in my own life. Perhaps the only concession I will make is admitting that I have stopped saying I'm a good person, as the contemplation and attempt to teach these things on a regular basis has made me profoundly aware of how easy it is to fail in that statement, and how holding such a belief often forces us to cover up memories where we clearly are not the good person.
Rule 1, I'm a good person. Rule 2, when this is called into question by others or my conscience, refer to Rule 1.
Welcome to the late modern psyche. But I do have some visuals and a little food for thought that may, if we allow ourselves a few moments of occasional quiet and contemplation, lead us all to approaching these three love utterances nearer, and in doing so, perhaps understanding God a little clearer. All right, here it goes. This is the transitional point. The something different is still coming, and this is probably going to annoy my beloved wife because I'm probably going to have to post a picture of our wedding. All right, when my wife and I married, we of course did the whole stomping on the glass thing. But in our case, we had 2 glasses to stomp on, one for each of us. I would like to say we had 2 purely for the underlying symbols that, like the 2 glasses, permeated our entire ceremony, that both of us take equal responsibility for our lives, marriage, and our Judaism. As the shattering of the glass traditionally represents the destruction of the temple and is a part of the ceremony to remind us that even in the moments of highest elevation and joy, we are balanced by the memory of brokenness and the reality of brokenness both around us in that moment and the brokenness that will surely come. In one of the most enduring memories I have of the ceremony, before the shattering of the twin glasses and after the recitation of the Sheva Barachot, or the 7 blessings, we chanted back and forth to each other the first verses from Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, where we remember the destruction of the first temple. As an act of love, we recite back and forth to each other the potential for brokenness. Of course, there was quite a practical reason as well behind the 2 glasses. My wife had found a brilliant artist in London who would make sculpture from the broken shards, and the artist had recommended 2 glasses instead of 1 for the result that we had wished. Ask not why a human does a good thing, and forget not sometimes that the Midrash is much better than the original purpose. So go forth, loved ones, and make good Midrash. Anyway, the result of this is the symbol that has helped me the most in trying to bridge the gap between you shall love in the text and figuring out what that means in reality. The broken shards were reforged into the Hebrew word for love, ahava. Now, that alone, I think, would be enough to move forward and give us a new perspective on love. In our marriage ceremony, we partially defined the action of love as the effort it takes to put something back together that's been broken. That may sound at least a bit romantic, but as there is a tangible before and after, that is actually anything but. It takes work. It takes willingness to work. It takes 2. It takes both willing to both admit the part played in creating the brokenness, as well as the effort to mold the broken into a new whole, a whole with a clear intentionality, ahava.
And now for something completely different.
Here's the transition. Deep breath. This falls outside of the rational. I think sometimes that's necessary to help get beyond the blocks that we have in our mind from progressing in our lives. So I'm going a place I don't usually go. It's not even that part, the reforging brokenness, that got me the most. Back to the word God, at least the ineffable name of God in Hebrew, represented by the letters Yud, He, Vav, and He. I also struggle with this name. It's one thing to make it central from day one of your rabbinate to help bring about the understanding that God is not a person, and that whenever we try to anthropomorphize God, we are stuck with a much smaller God subject to our limited definitions. That which has no boundary, when given a boundary, is no longer that which has no boundary. To quote from Taoism, if you can describe the eternal Tao, it's no longer the eternal Tao. If something's true, you're going to find its truth everywhere you look. But yet simultaneously, when I have been most depressed or paralyzed in my life, I've longed for the comfort of those anthropomorphic ideas, an infinite and very big parent to hold me and tell me it'll be okay. When in distress, it's hard to call out to a universal theological or philosophical idea. All right, full movement into the completely different. It's a little hard to follow and may require a little repetition, and all I can say is I think there's a there. I invite you into this contemplation with me. The ahava art is hanging over the door that divides the living room from the main bedroom in our humble GDR-era home. Our couch is situated that when I lie back and stretch out my legs, or what I as an author these days like to call my office and desk, I look up from the laptop for a moment. My eyes always move directly to ahava, aleph, he, bet, he. I imagine it's been obvious to many before, and just because this came to me, it doesn't mean I wasn't beaten to the punch by others who expressed similar insights. But just look at the 2 words together, God and love, and the relationship cannot be ignored. 4 Hebrew letters, each with 2 heys, each hey in the same position, and now we get into the cool but challenging stuff. In the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, the ineffable 4-letter name of God, each of the letters can act as a vowel or consonant, meaning that all the attempts to figure out what the name of God sounds like are absurd. I first learned this from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, and God was in this place, and I did not know it, when he expresses that when the high priest went into the temple to utter the name of God, since the name of God has only vowels, what the high priest actually did was sit there and breathed. He existed. He tied into the truth of the name of God, existence. Okay, that's the first moment. Switching over to ahava. The letter aleph also has no sound unless given a vowel to give it voice. In mystical thought, aleph represents the unknown before creation, the parts and mysteries of the universe that cannot be grasped by humans without the extra insertion of additional information. The question is asked among mystics as to why the Torah did not, as would seem logical, begin with the aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, beginning of creation, beginning of the alphabet. Well, the answer is because Torah symbolizes the beginning not of all of creation, but the narrative about creation that we have the capacity to grasp. What came before the creation that we can grasp cannot be apprehended as we are a part of the creation of the narrative. Hence, the Torah begins with the letter Bet, the second letter, the thing after the aleph, which is the first thing. Bereshit bara Elohim. In a time of beginning, God created. Look at the Bet. Hebrew is read from right to left, so to the right of the first letter of the first verse of the first book, the time before in a time of beginning, as if time had any meaning in that statement, the right side of the letter closes us off. It's blocked. We cannot understand what is not understandable. We cannot understand outside of a system where we are in a closed system, even if our closed system is infinite. We may penetrate someday to the mathematics that takes us to the tiniest possible blink after the Big Bang, but the before that can only be contemplated as it stands outside the set of all things that includes us. But look, the letter opens to the left, rushing us into what we can understand of creation. Light, darkness, will, sound, separation, growth, change. The one tangible and clearly utterable letter that love has, that the name of God does not, is the one representing the opening of consciousness and narrative. Bet is the letter that denotes possibility. Bet is the letter of generative. In the Torah, however, the aleph does come back in another primary symbol of beginning, this time the 10 utterances, the first of which begins with Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the eternal, your God. Bet begins consciousness, but aleph begins the process of moving back to the source. And how we do it is so fascinating. Bet sets forward the natural order of things, which as humans living in societies of far more than 150 people, means quite natural things like greed and deceit that also do not play well in sandboxes of millions. Aleph, perhaps ironically, represents the beginning of law and obligation, on top of it being the symbol of unknown, the original source, on top of how we evolved since that first moment of Bet, where all that once was in a perfect unity gets exploded into its tiniest bits of possibility. Those exploded bits and profound symbols of separation and difference necessitate an eventual movement back to the perfect united, represented by the soundless name of existence. We exist first, then we learn we need to exist together. The ineffable four-letter name of God is a variation of to be. The letters are a soundless, featureless placeholder for the acknowledgement that we are a part of that wordless one, but we are not one ourselves. We live in a world filled with brokenness and are ourselves broken. We are part of the one but are separated from within. The essence of all spirituality at some level is the desire to rejoin the one. The path is love, ahava, not the cheapened versions, something different. But here's where we take the deep breath and acknowledge the first images that do come to mind. Much like the long path to slowly let images of a bearded God get replaced by wordless contemplations of unity, moving from love to ahava requires a similar constant vigilance that we are not talking about sushi or that pop album. We're also not completely or only talking about that family or romantic love. We're talking about God, even if I've been told I should not. The unknowable and unapproachable name of existence becomes approachable first through love, the love that rests behind ahava. This should be, and for many is, obvious. As infants, the universe revolves around us. For many of us, this unfortunately continues for the rest of our lives. But for the ones that step into a path of interconnectivity, it is often because of the shock of love, or the absence. The person incapable of caring for another may be transformed by that first moment where we are with a partner and the boundaries, even for a moment, fall away and we lose where we end and the other begins. For in that moment, the other is no longer other. We exist together in that moment. In other words, the name of God is a part of what we are in that moment. The person unable to care about another's feelings may suddenly have a heart exploded open by holding their newborn for the first time. If the name of God is the symbol for what it is to not be separate, to not be objects of each other, and rather subjects together in the same story, then the 4-letter Hebrew word for love hints at this. To get to the place where we are joined by the name of the eternal, the pathway is figuring out what love is. The verb to love brings about the potential reality of the name of the eternal. We get the structure through love of the reminder of the name of God, but the 2 of the silent letters are replaced by tangible pointers. The way to this understanding of God is hinted at by the changes between these 2 words. Love contains all the possibility for the profound oneness of the eternal, and the gateways are the Aleph and Bet, how we live and how we understand life. The Bet gives us the creativity, the art, the beauty, the weeping at Brahms, the natural evolution and change that takes place over the course of existence. The Aleph gives us the obligation to do this ethically and reverently. Try to experience profound love when our most basic boundaries are not respected. We connect ourselves via our ritual tradition and then live that connection via our correct actions. We chant the Ve'ahavta in Parashat Vaetchanan as a daily challenge. You shall love the eternal your God is meaningless if we do not try to understand, instead of uttering by rote, what these words actually mean. The iterative question is simply that. Have we taken enough time? Have we taken any time to contemplate this, that we can at any time put these words into tangible actions? When we see our partner, we are obligated to love them. Not pop song, not sushi, ahava. When we look outside and see our neighbor, whether we like them or not, we are obligated to love them. Not pop music, not sushi, but ahava. When we see the homeless person on the street that we are struggling to welcome into our same place of humanity, we are obligated to love them. Not pop song, not sushi, not partner, but a subject under the same existence. And the only way to get to that point is to understand that they are as much a part of that ineffable name of God as we are. Are we so bound by popular connotations and human versions of divinity that we reduce our love from within our religious obligation to the same gravitas that we confer on our latest pop opus? Or are we willing to start exploring the love and the meaning of the eternal, where the walls that separate us from having the most basic connection to others begin to fall? Loving the eternal starts with loving, and loving starts with being willing to risk asking if we know what love is. Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next time.
פיצחו ורננו וזמרו, זמרו לאדוני בכינור